Hey, how you doing? It's Clayton here from howtodrawcomics.net, and welcome to today's demonstration. In this video, I'm going to be showing you the process for a creature design that I came up with a little while ago now, and this has just been sitting on my hard drive, stockpiled away with all the other video demonstrations that I record on a regular basis. I pretty much record everything that I draw. But this is one of my favorite designs that I think I've ever come up with for a creature because it just wound out looking so cool in the end. And I think it was high time I decided to do some narration for it and upload it for you guys to check it out. Because this is a great example, I feel, of how you can take kind of like the humanoid figure and mix it together with a completely different creature. In this case, we're going to be combining a human figure with an arachnid, right? So like a spider or a scorpion. And so I've dubbed this guy appropriately, I think, an arachnomorph. And the backstory, if there is any backstory at all, because I didn't put a whole lot of time into it, was that this guy and his other arachnomorph buddies became the dominant species on, his home planet or a future, possibly apocalyptic Earth of some kind where they've essentially hunted down humans and became, again, the dominant species, the top dog, so to speak. And I really wanted to go for a kind of tribal vibe with this particular character because to me, although he is the dominant species, he's not necessarily as advanced as human beings are. Along with his female counterpart here, I'm going to call her an arachnomorphette, let's just say. But I wanted to do a female version of the arachnomorph just to mix things up a little bit. I figure these guys, if they're going to be the dominant species, they're going to need a mate of some kind, so I decided to do this dude a favor and create one for him. It was really fun, kind of appropriating the design that I'd already came up with for the male arachnomorph onto a female figure, and I think that it came out really well in the end, actually, so we'll develop her a little bit further in a later video, which I'll pop up possibly later this week or next week, depending on how we go with the other videos that we're going to be rolling out throughout the rest of the week. But as you can see, like with any illustration I create, I've started the two of these characters out with a very basic, super rough sketch that really only hints toward the possible direction that I want to go with for their design. And this is the stage of the process which is probably the most mentally taxing, because you're sitting there and you're trying to think about, how am I going to construct the basic foundations of this character? That requires you to consider things such as size and placement and proportions and the way in which that character is going to be posed in a way in which exudes their attitude and their personality. And because this particular race of creatures is supposed to be, violent and primitive, like you wouldn't stand a chance against them. They're savage, right? So I really wanted that to come across in the way in which they were posed. And again, that requires you to think about, well, okay, if I wasn't just looking at a static image, a diagrammatic design of this creature, and in fact was instead looking at a animated version of it where it was brought to life, how would that look? How would they move? How would they hold themselves? And so I'm using that, and I'm trying to play it in my mind. I'm trying to really visualize what it'd be like to be in the presence of this particular character, this creature, this beast of a monstrosity. And how would I feel within their presence, and what would they look like? How tall would they be? How intimidated and afraid would I feel? And my mission is to try to, as much as possible, get that to come across within the depiction that I'm doing up of them right now, so that when the audience sees them, they feel the same way. They get that same vibe. if your character doesn't come across with that level of potency as far as the way in which they make people feel, the kind of mood that they conjure up and bring about, then they're going to have less impact on the page. And it's more than just the lines that you're laying down when it comes to drawing a character. It's so much more than that, because through those lines, you have to think about, what is it that you're expressing? Well, you're really expressing the existence of this character, an entire entity. And you have to somehow be able to communicate that on the page when you present these characters to the viewer, because they don't just see the lines, they're constructing some kind of interpretation, some kind of idea around the image that you've created for them and that you're showing them. So you really have to try to make sure that you're strategically crafting that image in a way that gets your message across, and in a way that causes and compels the audience to feel a particular way. Because when it invokes some kind of feeling, that's when they feel a true connection to it. And it could be fear, it could be nervousness, like the audience may feel in the presence of this arachnomorph. But it's got to be something in order for it to have any kind of impact. Otherwise, it really is just lines on a page. So think about the idea itself. Really, you're just a communicator. You're working within a visual medium, in a visual language, of course. So the trick is to try to get the way your particular visual language to match up with and be able to be translated into the visual language of your audience, whomever they may be. And your audience is usually going to consist of lots of different types of people. So, we all see the same, which is the advantage. We all kind of look at things and perceive them in a particular way. But still, nevertheless, it doesn't mean that we're going to perceive your idea in the way that you intended it to be perceived if you haven't presented it properly. So that's what I'm trying to do as much as possible right here as I draw up this arachnomorph. And you can see that I'm jumping straight into the details here as I work right over the top of that basic, very rudimentary sketch that I initially did up. And again, if I didn't have that sketch, if I didn't sit there and think it out and figure out how it was going to be posed, I wouldn't be able to draw over the top of it and place these details in like this. At this point in time, I'm able to think on a relatively creative level. I'm not really necessarily analyzing a whole lot. I'm just working off of what's already there, associating every line that I place down here to the initial foundations that I'd come up with. And so I can have a bit more fun at this point in the process. I'm able to kind of let go a little bit and relax and really let my creativity wander on the page. Because I kind of, at this point, I've got the roadmap. It's a little bit rough around the edges, sure, but I know where I'm going with this. So if you can create a good foundation for your artwork, what you'll find is that you're able to relax. And the more that you put into that foundation, the more that you're able to, take a load off and really just sink into the process a little bit, lose yourself within the creativity of it all. So I'm dropping in some shadows here, the major shadows that we're going to see throughout the figure, and usually they're going to occur on the body of the character. I don't place in big, thick shadows onto my characters like this as much. I was a really big fan of David Finch, and I still am a big fan of David Finch, his shadowing style and his rendering style. I use it, but I don't necessarily use it as much as he does. So I kind of reserve the really big, thick, and dark shadows these days when it comes to drawing comic book art characters. Comic book characters, rather. Characters in a comic book art medium. I reserved the shadows, at least shadows of this intensity, For characters who are darker in color, maybe for example they're wearing a dark or maybe even pure black outfit of some kind. And if that's the case, then sure, I'll place in big thick shadows around the anatomy just to convey that lowered value. And that works really, really well. But if you make everything a lower value, then it loses its effect. It loses its potency. So that's why I've tried to create essentially a scale for myself when it comes to creating comic book art these days, where I've got the darkest values and I've got the lightest values, and everywhere in between there's a range of shadow and rendering of varying intensities that I carefully use when it comes to shading my characters to create a nice, balanced amount of contrast within my work. Now, this is a very interesting demonstration because usually I approach the process in a very methodical way. In other words, I'll start out with the basic outline and I'll make sure that that's solid before I jump into the shadows, and most certainly before I jump into the details and the rendering. I've said this before, that if you kind of mess with the process and you work on different aspects of the illustration out of order, you can get lost within it and lose your way a little bit. But I think when it comes to creature design, especially, for me at least, I get a little bit less analytical and much more creative. Because creatures don't really require you to make them look a particular way. Unlike humans, we know what other people look like. We know the proportions of the human body back to front, and we can spot very quickly whether or not they look right or wrong, which is why as artists we have a really tough time making sure that we nail those proportions and the anatomy of the character and that it looks correct so that we don't get caught out. But when it comes to creatures, you can see this guy, he's got 3 arms and like 4 of those are 6 arms, and 3 of those arms don't even have hands, right? So, he's very far from human. And creatures can kind of look however you want them to look. He's still got humanoid-like anatomy, and I've certainly incorporated that in there. You can see that he's got deltoids and biceps and abdominal muscles, and he's got his pectoral muscles as well. He's a pretty buff creature, I have to say, and so he should be if he's going to be the dominant species, right? Again, these dudes aren't supposed to be advanced in any way. They're intelligent, sure, but they're more savage than intelligent, which is why when they started to evolve and, again, hunt humans, we didn't really stand a chance. At least that's kind of the story I've concocted in the back of my mind. And I go with the flow sometimes, especially when I'm creating a character like this. I don't necessarily have any premeditated ideas that I've sat down for days kind of fleshing out or anything like that. I just kind of jump straight into it and I see where it goes, and that can be really fun because it means that through not necessarily any cemented intention of my own, I'm able to come up with something that is a bit of a surprise by the end. And I'm able to sit back and look at it and go, hey, this is really cool. Like, to be able to create something from nothing is a very rewarding experience, at least for me. So I'm placing in some shadows just to break up the various complexities within the busyness of his design, especially around the furry kind of mane area at the back of his neck there and head, and some of the details on his face. And the reason I'm adding those shadows in is just to make a bit more contrast within those areas and thus bring about a more readable character, a more readable image, composition, and what have you. That readability is super important, especially when you're going to have this much detail. And you'll notice that the detail within this character, although he is very detailed, isn't all situated in one spot. It's kind of balanced out and shared across the entire character design. There's fur around the back of his head, there's a lot of detail in that, there's a lot of rendering, but then kind of breaks up a little bit, and there's some areas for the eyes to rest around the belly of the character and the upper arms. But then around the forearms, you can see that we're going to have more hair there. And there's also different types of rendering that I'm incorporating into this design. I've got the crosshatches around, the body, the exposed areas of skin, which also have the shadow as well, but they're kind of broken up in a way by the patches of fur throughout his body. I really wanted to give him a very animalistic look, so when I was coming up with this design, I sat back and I thought, well, this guy has to have clothes of some kind, So what kind of clothes would he have? And because he's a pretty beastly primordial creature, I figured, well, he's not going to be wearing anything fancy. So I figured, well, maybe they'd have this kind of tribal aesthetic to the kind of clothing and attire that they wore. And you can see as well, just the hair on the back of his head there almost looks like a crown a little bit, like he's the tribal leader. And then, of course, you've got these decorative elements within the hair around the bottom of just underneath and below his jaw, and around where the necklaces are as well that hang around his neck. You can see that there's these decorative little elements that have incorporated into his design. And I think that kind of, it gives him a somewhat, it doesn't make him look completely primitive. There is some kind of logic to the culture almost that these creatures follow. They have a society and they have hierarchies of their own, but they're just a little bit more violent, and they're a little bit more savage than the average human being. I think that if we were to come up against a creature like this, damn, we would stand no chance. I mean, maybe we would. We've got guns and firepower and what have you, but I think about StarCraft, if you've ever played that game by Blizzard Entertainment, and the Zerg. If we were overrun by the Zerg, which is essentially like this, it's like a horde of aliens that would just be so overwhelming that you wouldn't be able to do anything about it. So if I imagine if you had a creature like this, if they had numbers, we'd be in trouble. So yeah, and who knows? Maybe these creatures kind of started evolving and becoming what you're going to see me ultimately develop here after there was some kind of apocalyptic event on Earth. Maybe there was some kind of nuclear holocaust of some kind, and most of humanity died out, allowing an opportunity for creatures such as this to evolve. So, there's always different narratives that you can come up with for your characters, and I find that for me, the narrative is kind of inspired sometimes by the character themselves, so it's almost like the character comes first, and then I make up a story around them. At least that's kind of the way it works for me sometimes. It can work the other way around, of course, as well. It can work any way you want it to work, but I feel like being a visual person, when I see something, ideas begin to spawn, and associations begin to manifest from that idea, and that's exactly what happened here. I just came up with, really, at the end of the day, an interesting character design that I thought looked cool, and from there, I was able to create a story around it, which wasn't that hard. I mean, the hard part for me is really, it's much harder for me to come up with a design from a story that's already been established, because then your creativity is somewhat confined to a particular brief, really. and you don't have that freedom necessarily to explore the design. You've got these boundaries now that you've got to adhere to, and I find that is not a way to work which is as fun as this, because again, as I said to you, this character design came out as somewhat of a surprise, which was really, really awesome. I'd put all this time into it, and by the end, I was really happy with what I'd come up with. But I don't think I get that same amount of satisfaction from a brief that I have to stick to, which is super strict, where my creativity is confined in a rigid way. Probably because I'm an artist, and artists don't like rules, right? I say that, but I'm actually a very analytical person. I have methods and I have systems for constructing this stuff. I don't always stick to them strictly, necessarily, as I have mentioned within this particular demonstration, but I do find that as artists, we don't like to feel like our creativity is trapped in a box that it can't that it can't get out of and run around, right? We need to let our creativity roam a little bit on the page sometimes, and I think that's when we're in our element the most, when we can just really forget that we're sitting at the desk, forget that we're holding a pencil in our hand, and just really fall into this creative experience that causes time to move extremely fast without us even noticing, that causes us to forget about the outside world and to just really become a part of whatever it is that we're expressing on the page. And I know that seems a little bit woo-woo and kind of what would you say? A little bit Clayton's in the clouds a little bit there, he's away with the fairies. But I really do have to say that that's probably the feeling that I get when I'm working that I cherish the most. And it doesn't always happen, but the times in which it does, I find that to be the most rewarding time. That's why I draw. When I experience that feeling, it reminds me of why I'm doing this in the first place. There's not a whole lot of things that you can do in life that really gives you that very same feeling, that allows you to lose yourself like that. And it's not like playing a video game or watching a movie where you would just kind of switch off in that way. You're really engaged. You're so engaged, probably more engaged than you could be in almost any other activity, except maybe high-performing sports, for example. And maybe, any passion that you have when you're fully in it, maybe that's when that feeling truly manifests, regardless of what it is, whether it's creating music or, writing books or whatever it is. I gotta imagine that Stephen King, writing as much as he does, probably lives more in the fictional worlds that he comes up with than he does in the real world. And there is some kind of weird escapism. Is that what you would say when it comes to art, comic book art, and really any art form that you can think of, where we do just like to kind of switch off for a little while and forget about the everyday things that we've got to deal with, because this is much more fun when you think about it. I mean, it really is. Like, when else do you get to kind of just immerse yourself? It is like almost watching a movie in a sense. You're creating this character that could potentially be within a comic book one day, and as you do, you're imagining the stories that'll unfold around them and the roles that they will play. So now I'm adding in some skulls that are going to be dangling off of his belt there, his waist belt. It's not really a belt, it's more of a waistband, I guess, with some very fancy and intricate decorations incorporated into it. Naturally, I kind of got this idea from Predator, the movie. If you've ever seen that with Arnold Schwarzenegger, it's one of my favorite movies. And I guess this kind of plays into the storytelling element where, we're looking at human skulls here that are dangling off of his leathery waistband looking thing. And so that hints toward the idea that, okay, well, this guy, he enjoys hunting human beings. So he's probably a little bit dangerous, at least to us. And so I think that it's good when you can incorporate little storytelling elements like that into the visuals of your character design, because the audience are going to see that and they're going to begin coming to conclusions about who your character is and what they're about. I mean, you can leave little clues, little breadcrumbs in that way within your drawings, and it might not be a character design, it might just be an illustration that you've composed of characters that you've created for your comic book. And even in every frame of your comic book, in every single window of illustration that you present to your audience, there should be some kind of situation unfolding, some kind of conflict, some kind of story, something that's happening within it that the viewer can latch onto and become a part of. So again, breaking up some of that intense detail there with some shadows. And again, that really just adds contrast. And contrast roughly translates for us artists into a readable image if you know where to place it. And by contrast, what do I mean by that? Well, I mean that you're breaking up the white and black values. And by doing that in just the correct areas throughout your illustration, especially within the detailed areas, it's almost like a pattern that you're creating. You're creating a pattern of tone, pattern of blacks, pattern of whites, and a pattern of every other tone in between, sitting each next to one another and kind of composing them in a way which allows you to make a more readable image. Because if we didn't, let's take his forearm, for example, the one at the front, which you can see is crazy detailed. You got ropes and dangly decorations hanging off of the arm there, which is wrapped around the fur-like texture that sits underneath it. If I didn't break that up with blacks and have areas of very light tone as well, it'd be very hard to make out what's going on there. And it's probably even difficult to see what it is I'm talking about right now, because it looks cool as it is. And it's like, it is what it is. How can, what went into that? What was it that actually made it look readable? And if I really nail it down, it's the way in which I place those drop shadows in, the very little drop shadows underneath the ropes that are wrapped around his forearm there. And you can see that those drop shadows are sitting against, at any one moment in time, a highlight which runs along the top of the rope. And so when you've got the highlight of the rope sitting next to the drop shadow of the rope next to it, then again you create that pattern of black, white, black, white, black, white. And again, you can do this with different levels of tone as well. But you could apply the same thing to, for example, his head. His head is fairly light in tone, in value, in comparison to the darker shades of tone found in the fur mane around his shoulders and neck. Do you see that? So that's creating, again, that white, or at least a lighter tone against a slightly darker tone. And so our eyes are able to decipher what it is we're seeing a little bit easier because of that. And then you look at the necklaces underneath his head there, and how that almost separates the lighter tone of his head from the lighter tones of the front of his body, bar the shadows. And again, we're looking at that pattern where we're seeing the white, slightly darker tone, and then the white again, and then a slightly darker tone around his waist, where we see that waistband and the skulls hanging off of it. So when you're able to compose the different areas of contrast throughout your design in a strategic way, in that pattern-like way where you are really attempting to draw the viewer's attention to specific areas of the character's design, that's when you'll be able to create a readable image that they understand, that they get, that they're not confused to look at, because otherwise it can all kind of get lost in the details. And trust me when I say this, it's not hard to do that. If I was to really crosshatch the heck out of everything here, and I know it probably already looks like I have, but you gotta trust me on this, I haven't. If I was to crosshatch everything and add details absolutely everywhere, what would happen is probably the opposite to my initial intention, which would be to make it look cooler and more interesting. It would just flatten it out into one kind of leveled out pile of messiness, and no one will be able to tell what was going on. It'd just be this complex, overly intricate, disorientating mess on the page. And that's something that you want to avoid at all costs, especially with these more detailed, inherently detailed designs. You want to try to make sure that you're really thinking about where you're placing that shading, and that's probably where the logical considerations do come into play to an extent when it comes to this later stage after the foundations have been laid in. There is still some thinking involved. Throughout every single portion of the illustration, you're going to be, making decisions, and you're going to be trying to compose it in the best way that you can. Now, when it comes to the crosshatches that you're seeing me place in, and the little itty-bitty details that I'm placing around his claws there and the rest of his body, I'm really trying to think in terms of form here. So you can see how the band that I've just wrapped around the upper arm of the back bicep there, I've really tried to make sure that instead of it being a straight line, it's curved so that it appears to us as though that rope isn't just sitting on top of the arm, but it's actually surrounding it. It's curving around the form of the underlying arm. And in that same way, I'm curving every single hatch that I lay down onto the surface of the forms that you're seeing within this character, and I'm making sure that they follow the surface of those forms as well. So every single detail needs to do this in order for it to pop off of the page with this three-dimensional quality that is eye-catching, that looks convincing, that makes the character look real, as if they could step right out of the page here and come to life. That's really what we're trying to create as we compose these details and all these little tiny crosshatches. And if you can do that successfully, that's when you're able to, and this is really what you're doing when it comes to rendering, and any detail that you add on. You're trying to describe form, and you're trying to describe the tone of that particular area that you're working on, so that's another thing. But you're also trying to describe the various materials and textures throughout the character's design, and you can, of course, see that most evidently within the fur that I've placed around this character, around the back of the head and the shoulders and the forearms and whatnot. I guess that's kind of where, as dudes, we typically grow a lot of hair. I'm finding that as I get older, I'm growing hair in places that I never grew hair before. And I thought I was, you'd like to think that you get to a certain stage where you're in your mid-20s and you're like, okay, this is all the hair that I'm ever going to grow. But no, there's like another stage of puberty, I swear, where you get to like, you're after 25, you're heading toward 30. For some of you, you may think that I'm still pretty young, actually, in saying that, but I'm feeling like I'm getting a bit older now. And you start to notice, wait a second, where do these little strands of hair on my shoulder come from? Right? Because I'm not a typically hairy guy. But who knows? Maybe as I get older, I will be. Maybe by the time I'm 60, I'll have hair coming out of my ears, and I'll have a full carpet on my back and hair dangling out of my nose and whatnot. So, I guess the same areas of hair that I've incorporated into this design apply. And I think that was intentional as well, because although we're looking at a completely different creature here, a whole other animal, and this is by no means a character that you would call human, there's still these associations where, hey, like there's this hair situated on the back of his head there, and his shoulders, he's bald on top. He's kind of like an older beast, I feel like, and that visual association is kind of inherent within his design. So we're leaving these visual cues here that are allowing the viewer to understand our design and kind of make up their own mind about them. And it's not in your face. It's not something which, you have to slap the viewer with or anything like that. Like, you don't have to make any of these things super obvious, but you're almost hinting at a lot of them. You're almost hinting at these little things that you're incorporating into your design that the audience is going to be able to look at and go, oh, okay, like, the interpretation that I'm creating in my head here is probably what it's supposed to be. Okay, so the way that they're understanding it is probably the way that they're supposed to understand it. And usually it's going to be thanks to the little elements that you've incorporated into the design that allow them to get the idea. Because when you're showing somebody a presentation of something which is completely new, you're showing them an idea that they've never seen before, or we talk about this in teaching a lot, concepts that people have never ever heard of can be very difficult to interpret and to understand what it is you're trying to learn, you're trying to interpret. And the only way really that you can successfully interpret it and understand it is by linking the new thing that you're seeing back to something that you already know about and understand. So again, I mentioned the areas of hair within this design. Well, the audience is going to be able to understand and get a feel for this character because of the fact that, hey, he's got hair in the places across his body that most of us have hair. And, maybe it's kind of like, maybe he's not growing it necessarily, but I did think about spiders, and I'm like, well, some spiders are pretty darn hairy, so it'd be cool to incorporate some of that just to increase the creepiness of this dude a little bit. But my point is try to incorporate these visual cues that allow people to lock onto your illustration and get what it is that you're showing them. Again, you want to leave them little hints here and there just to say, hey, this is kind of what I'm leading up to. This is what I'm trying to show you here. I know you've never seen my design before, or you've never seen the character that I'm showing you, but, maybe there's something in here that you've experienced in the past, another character that you could associate my design to and kind of understand it a little bit better in your own way. And if you can become a master at doing that, then you're going to be able to do up a design for your character that connects with people on a whole other level, on a very deep and fundamental level. So I'm adding in some details around his legs there, really trying to flesh out their design a little bit more. We got some hair, some more fur, just like we've incorporated onto his forearms there, and that kind of, it links the design together to make it a little bit more tighter. You'll notice that for some reason there was a weird bug on the day that I recorded this in Manga Studio, or in the application that I was using to record the demonstration in the first place, that caused there to be this random hand cursor that was very distracting, along with the small little tiny brush there that I'm using to draw out the lines. So just ignore that. That's not supposed to be there. I don't know why it's there, and it really did ruin my little video that I'm trying to put together for you guys here. But that happens from time to time when I'm recording these videos. Sometimes, for one reason or another, it just doesn't pan out the way that I intended it to, and of course after that point it's just a little bit too late to go back and start again because the illustration's already drawn out. But I love the way that this character came together. Again, I'm jumping in there, starting to add some textures to his claws there. He doesn't have a whole lot of stability around the base of his feet there. As human beings, we have feet that are kind of, shaped and elongated in a way that allows us to balance nicely and stay grounded. This dude kind of manages to balance on just his claws. So I guess what I'm trying to infer here in the overall structure of his leg is that he balances himself through the way he moves and positions his body, not necessarily via his physical structure. I mean, his physical forms that make up his structure. So the shape of his foot isn't necessarily alone going to keep him stable, but the way in which his leg is composed certainly should be able to balance him out a little bit more. And when we start to develop the design for the female arachnomorph, the arachnomorphette, we'll see a more kind of illustrated example as to how these guys move around. And that'll, hopefully tie the creature together in a bit more of a solid way. Now, that's really handy to do as well if you do come up with a design and it looks kind of complex and you're not really sure as to whether or not it's structured in a way that works functionally. It may be worth your while to do up another illustration just off to the side, which kind of shows the character in motion and kind of helps you as the designer to figure out, well, hey, how's this thing going to move? Sure, it looks cool, but is it actually going to be able to move? And that's really when you're able to kind of problem solve a little bit there and figure out whether or not there is any flaws, functional flaws within the design, and whether or not they need to be changed. Adding in a little platform there just around his feet. And details like this, it's not a full background. It's just a couple of rocks on the ground. But it's enough to kind of place him in a world of his own, to give him a sense of, or to give the overall illustration a sense of environment and to show the kind of habitat that he might be within. And I think that just really helps you to draw the audience in as well, when you're able to even just, a basic little sketch like that around the base of his feet. It's enough to hint toward a world. Again, a lot of illustration, comic book illustration, it's all about leaving hints, leaving those breadcrumbs along the way to make sure the audience has enough information there to follow you along the path and make sure that by the end of it, they've got a solid, wholesome idea that links up with the interpretation of the idea that you had in mind in the first place. So again, just adding in some details. We're bringing this illustration through to a close very, very soon. In fact, it's been a fun ride, that's for sure. And to be able to see it come together again is just, it's awesome. It makes me want to draw creatures a little bit more. I don't draw them enough, but when I do, I find it an exceptionally satisfying experience, and the end outcome is pretty cool as well. So certainly going to have to book a few more creature sketches in, I think, into my schedule. If you saw the demon videos from way back when, I kind of did those up around about the same time as I did this guy, and same experience, more creaturely designed that came out really, really well, and one that I super enjoyed working on. So that's my Arachnomorph. I hope that you enjoyed this demonstration. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you learned a thing or two, and if not, at least became inspired just by watching this video. There's a lot of detail that goes into an illustration and a design overall such as this, so don't let it intimidate you too much. It's baby steps the whole way through. You learn one aspect of the illustration process, and before you know it, you're able to compose your own illustrations, your own creatures to this level of complexity. But I'll let you in on a little secret right now. It's not really the detail that's the hard part. It's balancing that detail, and most importantly, making sure that you've got a solid foundation to work over the top of. Once you've got those things handled, you'll be good to go. Again, thanks so much for watching. If you'd like more tips, tricks, and tutorials, be sure to visit www.howtodrawcomics.net. Again, we've got a bunch of tutorials there, we've got a bunch of videos, and we got some courses as well, which kind of delve deeper into this stuff if you're interested in really getting a handle on it. So, look forward to seeing you there. Until next time, keep on creating, keep on practicing, and I'll catch you in the next video.